Sign it. Today. Right here.
Not without an independent audit.
You think you have that kind of leverage right now?
You're gonna torch everything Dad built over your stubbornness. I'm not the one doing the torching.
Last chance.
Mom. And your keys. If you come back, you destroy this family.
My mother's last words on that mountain were meant as a warning. What she didn't understand, standing there with her back already turned, was that I had no intention of returning the same woman they had left behind. 3 years is a long time to disappear. It is also a long time to build something no one sees coming. She meant those words as a threat. What she never asked was what it would mean if I actually did. If this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We put out a new one every single week, and you don't want to miss where this one goes. My father built Holloway Mountain equipment the way most men of his generation built things slowly, with his hands and without asking for permission. He started with a single warehouse on the edge of Cedar Hollow, Colorado, a town that existed mostly because the mountains around it had copper in them. The companies that came to extract that copper needed equipment. Arthur Holloway made sure they came to him. By the time I was born, the company had 3 warehouses, a fleet of service vehicles, and enough contracts to put my siblings through college without the family ever losing a night of sleep over money. My father wasn't a complicated man. He believed in showing up and doing the work right the first time. I came back to help him 8 years before he died. I had offers from 2 firms in Denver and 1 in Chicago, all of them better on paper than returning to Cedar Hollow to work alongside a man who still kept his invoices in a paper binder. But my father had built something real, and I understood something about it that he didn't. The business was healthy, but it was fragile in the way that anything built entirely around one person's judgment tends to be. He knew every customer by name and handled every major contract personally. If he was ever gone, there would be nothing holding the structure together except loyalty and habit, and neither of those survives very long in the industrial equipment sector. So I came home. I spent the first year just learning the operation from the inside, every supplier relationship, every customer contract, every clause in every service agreement. What I found was a business that had been running on goodwill for longer than it should have. My father charged less than he should have, trusted more than he should have, and had never once renegotiated a supplier rate in 12 years. I didn't change any of that overnight. I started small, built the systems gradually, and let the results make the argument for me. Within 6 years, revenue had nearly tripled. We had new enterprise clients, a restructured logistics division, and supplier agreements that actually reflected what the market was doing. My father was proud in the quiet way. He was proud of everything. He never said it directly, but he stopped questioning my decisions somewhere around year 3. My brother Curtis noticed the growth too. He just drew a different conclusion from it. Curtis had always assumed that the company would eventually pass to him, not because he had done anything particular to earn it, but because he was the oldest son, and in his mind, that logic was self-evident. He had worked at Holloway Mountain Equipment since he was 22, mostly in operations and account management, and he was competent in the narrow way that people are competent when they've never had to compete for anything. He could run a meeting and charm a client over dinner. What he couldn't do was read a balance sheet with any real precision, and he had no instinct for the structural decisions that kept the business growing. He knew this about himself, though he would never have said so out loud. I think what he felt toward me was something he had learned to call concern for the family, but which was, underneath, just the ordinary fear of someone who could see what he was not. My sister Denise handled the company's finances and had for years. She was sharp and controlled and always had an explanation ready for any number that needed explaining. My father trusted her completely. I trusted her less the longer I watched her work. though I couldn't point to anything specific for a long time. There was just a quality to the way she presented information, a smoothness that always moved slightly faster than the data could justify. Our Uncle Wade managed warehouse operations and logistics. He had been with the company since before I was born and treated his position as a kind of inherited right. He sourced vendors, managed contracts with shipping and hauling companies, and knew the physical side of the operation better than anyone. He was also the kind of man who had always found ways to make sure his own interests lined up with his professional decisions, and who had learned how to do it in ways that were difficult to trace. When my father died, a heart attack, fast, no warning, I was in the middle of negotiating a new service agreement with one of our largest mining clients. Curtis called me, and I drove 3 hours back to Cedar Hollow, and by the time the funeral was arranged, the dynamics of the company had already shifted in ways I hadn't fully registered yet. My mother, Marlene, became the ceremonial head of the family and assumed a board position that was largely honorific, but that she treated as absolute authority. Curtis stepped into the operational leadership role as though he had always been standing in that spot waiting. And I kept doing the work, the client relationships, the strategic contracts, the supplier negotiations, because the work still needed to be done and I was still the one who knew how to do it. For 2 years after my father's death, I told myself that the discomfort I felt was just grief taking a strange shape. I told myself the reason Curtis's decisions didn't make sense was that he was still learning. I told myself the reason Denise's numbers sometimes required 3 separate conversations to fully understand was that she had a different communication style. I was wrong on all of it, and the thing about being wrong in that particular way is that you resist the evidence longer than you should, because the alternative is understanding that people you grew up with have been doing something you cannot forgive. The discovery happened the way most real discoveries happen, not in one sudden moment, but in a sequence of small moments that eventually stopped allowing for innocent explanations. I was preparing a report for a potential new client who wanted a detailed picture of our financial position, and something in the vendor payment records didn't line up with what I knew about our operating costs. The discrepancy was not dramatic, the kind of gap that could be explained by a timing difference or a billing cycle. But I had been working with these numbers long enough to know that this particular gap didn't have an innocent explanation, so I kept pulling threads. What I found, over the course of about 3 weeks, was that Holloway Mountain Equipment was carrying debt significantly larger than anything reflected in the internal reports I had access to. Several of our largest vendor payments were going to companies that, when I traced the registration documents, had direct connections to Wade. The billing rates those vendors charged us were well above market. Denise had routed the payments through a sub-account structure that made them appear as routine operational expenses, which meant they had passed through every internal review without triggering any flags. Curtis had known. He had not only known he had been using the distorted financials to justify a plan to take out a new secured loan against our main production facility, which would have generated a significant cash infusion that would have masked the drain for at least another 2 years. For the loan to be approved, the bank required signatures from all major shareholders. My father had left me a meaningful stake in the company. That meant they needed me. Curtis called a family meeting. He presented the loan as a necessary strategic move, an opportunity to expand, to modernize, to secure the company's future. Denise had prepared materials that made the financial picture look manageable. Wade sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, which was how he usually operated when something important was being decided. My mother sat at the head of the table in the chair my father used to occupy and watched me the way she always watched me when she expected me to comply. I told them I wouldn't sign. Not yet. Not without an independent audit of the company's full financial position before any new debt was added to the structure. I said it as plainly as I could, without accusation, because I still did not want to say out loud what I believed I had found. I told them that if the company was in the condition they were describing, an audit would only confirm it, and the loan would go through without any complications. The room went very still. Curtis said I was trying to take control of something that had never been mine to control. He said it with the specific tone of someone who has been preparing that sentence for longer than the current conversation. Denise looked at me the way she always looked at me when she believed I was being deliberately difficult, a tight, careful expression that communicated disappointment without exposing anything underneath it. My mother said what she always said when she needed the family to close ranks. She said family protects family. She said it as though it were a fact of nature rather than a choice, as though she had not noticed, or not cared, that protection was only flowing in one direction. And I said, for the first time in my life, clearly, in that room, with all of them watching, that protecting family did not mean helping family steal. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. I had named the thing, and once it was named, we all understood that nothing that had been possible before that sentence was possible anymore. The invitation to Pineglass Mountains came from my mother, 2 weeks later. She presented it as she had always presented the annual winter trip as a family tradition, a gesture toward the memory of my father. Arthur Holloway had taken us to those mountains every winter when we were children. He loved the particular quality of silence you could find above the tree line, where the wind came through and you could hear exactly nothing made by human hands. He had scattered his own father's ashes somewhere near Frostline Pass, and he had told us once that he would want something similar for himself. We had done that after his funeral, made the trip, stood at the overlook, let the ashes go. Marlene said she wanted us to go back this year. She said she wanted the family to find its way back to each other before the anniversary of his death. I did not want to go. I went anyway, because I still believed in some version of the family that trip was supposed to represent, and because I thought perhaps the distance from the office and the legal pressure might allow for a conversation that wasn't possible in Cedar Hollow. I was wrong about that too. We drove up on a Friday morning and stayed at the old family cabin near Frostline Pass, a structure my father had maintained with the same quiet insistence he brought to everything not beautiful, but solid, built to last. The first day was civil. We cooked together, avoided the subjects that mattered, and spoke in the careful register of people who have agreed, without discussion, to pretend. By Saturday morning, the pretense had run its course. Curtis brought the loan documents on the hike. We were moving up the trail toward the overlook where my father's ashes had been scattered, the same path we had walked 2 years before, the same cold and the same thin air, when Curtis stopped and took the folder from his pack. He held it out to me. He told me this was the last opportunity to handle this cleanly, before it became something none of us could control. He said it with the particular patience of someone who has already decided what happens next. I said no. I said that when I returned to Cedar Hollow, I was going to contact an independent auditor and a corporate attorney, and that whatever the audit found would determine what happened to the loan application and to my continued involvement with the company. I said it knowing exactly what it meant. I think I believed, even at that moment, that there were lines they would not cross. I had known these people my entire life. I had sat at dinner tables with them and attended their children's birthdays and built my professional career around a company that bore their name. You do not easily arrive at the understanding that people you love are capable of doing what they did next. When I moved to leave the trail, I lost my footing on a section of icy rock. My ankle turned badly, and I went down hard. The pain was immediate and serious enough that I couldn't put weight on the foot. I reached for a handhold to pull myself up, and I looked to Curtis, because he was closest. He reached for my pack instead. He pulled it off my shoulder, not roughly, but with a kind of deliberate calm that was worse than roughness, and set it to the side. Denise was already reaching for the pocket of my jacket where she had seen me put my phone that morning. She took it without saying anything. Wade had been standing slightly apart on the trail, and he stepped forward now and picked up my keys from where they had fallen from the pack. I told myself they were making a point. I told myself this was a demonstration, a form of pressure, a moment designed to show me how isolated I was and how completely I depended on their cooperation to get off that mountain safely. I told myself this because the alternative, the thing that was actually happening, was not something I was ready to understand. They turned and started back down the trail. I called after them. I called after Curtis first, then Denise, then Wade, and none of them slowed. My mother had been standing perhaps 10 feet behind me for the whole conversation, and I turned to her with the specific desperation of someone who still believes one person in the room has a limit. I asked her to call for help. I asked her to wait. I told her my ankle was badly injured and the temperature was dropping and there was weather coming in from the northwest. I could see it in the way the sky had changed over the past hour. I asked her not to leave me there. She stood still for a moment. She looked at me in a way I had never seen her look at me before, not unkind, exactly, but settled, as though she had already completed the necessary internal work, and what remained was only the physical act of leaving. She said that if I came back, I would destroy the family. Then she turned and followed the others down the mountain. I understood then, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when every other interpretation has been exhausted, that this was not a demonstration. They were not making a point. They believed that the cold and the dark and the distance from the nearest road would solve the problem I had become. They had stood there and calculated that outcome and decided it was acceptable, and then they had walked away. The storm arrived faster than I expected. I had no phone, no pack, no way to put real weight on my left foot, and the temperature was dropping in the specific way it drops at altitude when the wind changes, not gradually, but in sudden steps, each one colder than the last. I moved the only way I could, down and off the exposed trail, into the cover of the terrain below the pass. It took me hours to find the old forestry station, a structure I remembered from a hike years earlier, abandoned, but with walls and a roof and enough shelter to keep the worst of the wind off. I stayed there for what I later calculated was nearly 2 days. When the geological survey team found me, I was in a state of severe hypothermia and could not stand without help. They called an ambulance and stayed with me until it arrived. The police contacted my family. Curtis told them I had become upset during the hike, had argued with the group, and had walked away on my own. He said they had searched for me and couldn't find me, and had eventually assumed I had found my own way down and decided to leave separately. There were no cameras on that trail. There were no independent witnesses. There was nothing that would allow a prosecutor to prove that what had happened was what had happened. I spent 4 days in the hospital. My ankle required surgery. My core temperature had dropped low enough to cause real concern in the first 24 hours. On the 4th day, I checked myself out and drove to a hotel in a town I had never been to and sat on the bed for a long time. I thought about going to the police with my own account. I thought about hiring an attorney and challenging the company's financial records in court. I thought about returning to Cedar Hollow and confronting each of them individually with everything I knew and watching them explain it. But I had been on that mountain. I had called after my mother and watched her walk away. I understood, clearly and without the possibility of revision, what my family was willing to do to protect what they had built. And I understood something else, that going back to Holloway Mountain Equipment to reclaim my position there was not what I wanted. What I wanted was something they had not thought to defend against, because it required more patience and more precision than anything they had ever tried to build themselves. I didn't want to reclaim my place in their company. I wanted to own it. I drove out of Colorado on a Tuesday morning in November with 2 bags, a laptop, and enough cash to cover 3 months of living expenses if I was careful about it. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't file a forwarding address. I had a friend from graduate school who had offered me her spare room in Briarstone, Oregon, for as long as I needed it, and that was the only plan I had, which was, at the time, more than enough. The first thing I did when I arrived was sleep for 2 days. The second thing I did was sit down and write out, in as much detail as I could reconstruct from memory, Everything I had found in the Holloway Mountain Equipment financial records before I lost access to them. I wrote it longhand in a legal pad because I didn't trust any device I had used while I was still inside the company. I wanted a record. I wanted to understand exactly what I was working with and exactly what had been done. Then I set the legal pad aside and started building something new. Ironleaf Procurement Group began as a single-room operation with 2 people, myself and a logistics analyst named Marcus Webb, who had worked under me at Holloway Mountain Equipment for 4 years and who had followed me to Oregon without asking for an explanation beyond the one I was willing to give, which was that the situation at Holloway had become untenable and that if he was willing to take the risk of starting over with me, I believed we could build something worth the effort. He said yes before I finished the sentence. The third desk in the room sat empty for 7 months before we could afford to fill it. What Ironleaf did in those early months was the same work I had always done, only without the institutional name behind it. We helped mid-sized companies untangle their supply chains, reduce vendor costs, renegotiate contracts that had been allowed to drift above market rate, and in several cases, restructure their procurement operations well enough to avoid insolvency. I had no reputation in Oregon that meant anything to anyone. I had a track record that existed inside a company whose name I could reference, but whose internal workings I could not fully discuss. What I had, in practical terms, was the ability to walk into a room, look at a company's numbers, and see the problem faster than anyone else in the room could see it. That turned out to be enough to get the first client. The first client's results were enough to get the second. The second led to 2 more within 6 months. Reputation in the procurement industry is slow to build and very difficult to fake. A company either produces savings that appear on the balance sheet or it doesn't. A renegotiated supplier contract either holds or it collapses at the first friction point. There is no version of that work where good presentation substitutes for actual competence, which is why I had always been comfortable in it. By the end of the first year, Ironleaf had 6 active clients and a small team. By the end of the second year, we had moved into a proper office, added 3 more staff, and taken on our first enterprise-level contract, a regional construction company that needed its entire materials sourcing operation restructured ahead of a major expansion. That single contract generated more revenue than everything we had built in our first 12 months combined. I did not spend those 2 years thinking about Holloway Mountain Equipment with any regularity. That is not entirely true. There were evenings when I thought about it more than I wanted to, and there were moments in client meetings where something in the numbers would briefly remind me of a pattern I had seen in Denise's reports, and I would have to redirect my attention with some effort. But I had made a deliberate decision not to monitor the company. I had walked away from that situation for a reason, and revisiting it, even passively, was a way of refusing to let it go. So I let it go, or I tried to, and I focused on building the thing in front of me. It was Grant Bellamy who brought Holloway Mountain Equipment back into my line of sight. Grant had been my corporate attorney since Ironleaf's second year, a quiet, precise man who had learned, over time, not to waste words in my presence because I would simply wait him out until he arrived at the point. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon and asked if I had half an hour. I said yes, and he came to the office with a folder, which he set on my desk without preamble. He explained that a regional commercial bank was actively seeking buyers for a distressed debt position, a substantial secured loan that had gone into technical default because the borrowing company had violated multiple covenant terms over the preceding 18 months. The company was Holloway Mountain Equipment. The loan was secured against the main production facility in Cedar Hollow. Without a capital injection from a new source, the company would lose control of its primary asset within a matter of months, and once that happened, reorganization under bankruptcy protection was the most likely outcome. I looked at the folder for a long time. I didn't open it immediately. I was aware of what I was feeling, and I was aware that what I was feeling was not a useful guide to what I should do. So I kept the folder closed and asked Grant how he had come across this. He told me the bank had approached a boutique investment advisory firm he had a relationship with, looking for qualified buyers who understood the industrial equipment sector. Grant had flagged it because he knew my history enough of it anyway, and because he believed, from a purely financial standpoint, that the underlying business had real recoverable value beneath what its current management had done to the balance sheet. I asked him to give me a week before we discussed it further. Then I opened the folder. What the audit showed the one Grant commissioned through a third party before I put any money toward the position was exactly what I had expected and something I hadn't quite anticipated. The expected part, the company was in genuinely serious trouble. Curtis had taken on debt at a pace that made sense only if you assumed the revenue growth I had built would continue indefinitely, which it had not, because the clients who had driven that growth had started leaving within 8 months of my departure. The production facility was undermaintained. Key supplier relationships had deteriorated. 2 of the enterprise accounts I had personally secured had taken their contracts to competitors. The financials were a record of what happens when a business runs on inertia rather than management. The part I hadn't fully anticipated, the bones of the company were still solid. The technical team my father had built over 30 years was largely still intact. The equipment inventory, though poorly managed, retained significant market value. The regional supplier network, the relationships with haulers, manufacturers, and specialty vendors that made Holloway Mountain equipment useful to its clients still existed, because those relationships were structural, built into geography and contract history, in ways that didn't disappear simply because Curtis had stopped tending to them. What I was looking at was a company that had been damaged by its leadership, not by its market. That was a different kind of problem, and a much more solvable one. I told Grant I wanted to proceed, and I told him how. We established a holding company at a distance from Ironleaf, structured carefully, with multiple intermediary layers, all of it legally sound, none of it designed to obscure anything from regulatory scrutiny, but organized in a way that would not immediately reveal the identity of the ultimate beneficial owner to anyone conducting a routine search. I was not willing to do anything that couldn't be defended in a courtroom. What I wanted was enough time to complete the acquisition before Curtis or Denise or Wade realized who was on the other side of it, because if they knew, they would find a way to complicate the transaction. Through the holding structure, we purchased the distressed debt position from the bank at a price meaningfully below its stated value. The bank accepted because the alternative was a protracted default process with an uncertain recovery. We then approached 2 minority shareholders who had taken small equity positions in Holloway Mountain equipment years earlier, men who had known my father and who had watched, with visible frustration, as the company's performance deteriorated under Curtis and purchased their stakes at a fair price. They agreed without much persuasion. By the time all of that was complete, the holding company controlled enough of the company's debt and equity to determine the outcome of any restructuring process. The family was not aware of any of this. They knew a corporate investor had taken an interest in the debt. They assumed, as people who have never built anything from scratch tend to assume, that the investor was a distant institution primarily concerned with return on capital and not with the specific internal history of the borrowing company. It was during the due diligence process, 3 weeks into the acquisition work, that I found the second layer of what my family had done. I was reviewing archived communications and internal records that the holding company had obtained as part of the debt purchase documents that included historical correspondence about client relationships and operational decisions. I found that after the night on Pineglass Mountains, after my extended disappearance and subsequent failure to return to the company, Curtis had communicated to several key clients and partners that I had experienced a serious mental health crisis and had left the company abruptly without warning. He had done this not to explain my absence, which could have been done simply, but to preemptively discredit any account I might later give of events at Holloway Mountain Equipment. He had told people I had been unstable, that my judgment had become unreliable in the months before I left, that the company was better positioned now that things had stabilized. Beyond that, I found records showing that Curtis had taken personal credit for 3 major client contracts that I had negotiated and managed before my departure. In internal presentations and at least 2 external industry events, he had described those contracts as outcomes of his own leadership initiatives. And I found something more deliberate than either of those things. Denise had reclassified a series of expense entries costs associated with the vendor fraud scheme she and Wade had been running and had recorded them as originating from my former division. The entries were dated to periods when I was still nominally part of the company, designed to look to anyone reviewing the historical record as though the financial irregularities had originated in the division I ran rather than in the ones that Curtis and Denise controlled. They had not simply left me on a mountain and hoped I wouldn't come back. They had spent the months after the mountain making sure that if I did come back, no one would believe me. I read through those documents in my office on a Saturday evening when everyone else had left for the day. I sat with that information long enough to understand it fully, and then I went home and cooked dinner and watched something forgettable on television and made myself sleep. I had learned, over the previous 2 years, that the decisions made in the acute period of feeling something were almost always worse than the decisions made after the feeling had been acknowledged and set aside. I knew what I was going to do. I was going to do it correctly, not quickly. Curtis had not been passive during this period. He understood that a significant creditor had taken a position in the company, and his instinct, which was the instinct of someone who had spent his career treating corporate problems as political problems, to be managed rather than operational problems, to be solved, was to go around it. He spent several weeks pursuing alternative capital sources. He had conversations with 3 private lenders and at least 1 regional investment group. None of them moved forward after conducting their own preliminary review of the company's financial position. Denise made adjustments to several financial reports during this period, softening some of the more alarming indicators to make the company appear more creditworthy than it was. Wade, whose primary concern had shifted from revenue extraction to self-protection, began trying to move contractual relationships and vendor agreements out of the main corporate entity and into subsidiary structures, a maneuver that, if completed, would have stripped recoverable value from the asset before any change of ownership could capture it. Grant flagged Wade's activity as soon as the pattern became clear. We had been monitoring the company's structural changes as part of the ongoing due diligence, and what Wade was attempting was visible in the filing records. Grant moved to block the transfers through the mechanisms available to a secured creditor, and because the holding company's legal position was strong, the challenges succeeded. Most of what Wade attempted to move stayed put. Then, late on a Thursday night, Grant called. His voice was controlled in the way it gets when he is managing something he doesn't want to escalate unnecessarily. He told me that in the course of reviewing the holding company's ownership chain, a review that Wade's attorney had apparently initiated, looking for grounds to challenge the creditor's standing, a connection had surfaced. One of the early investors in the holding entity, a position taken on during the initial capitalization phase before all the intermediary structures were fully in place, was held in trust by a business contact whose name appeared elsewhere in the Holloway Mountain equipment vendor records. The connection was indirect and would require real investigative effort to follow to its conclusion. But if Wade's attorney was already looking, and if they found it before the transaction closed, they could potentially use it to seek a delay, and a delay, at this stage, was all they needed to find the alternative capital that had so far eluded them. I had less than 12 hours before the transfer documents were scheduled for final execution. Grant told me this in the same steady voice he used to tell me everything, and I understood from the steadiness that he had already identified the path forward. He just needed my authorization to move quickly. I gave it. We worked through the night, Grant and his team and me, unwinding the connection that had emerged, restructuring the affected portion of the holding entity's ownership in a way that was both legally clean and procedurally invisible to anyone reviewing the chain from the outside. By 6 in the morning, the exposure had been closed. By 8, Grant was in his car driving to Cedar Hollow. At 9 that morning, in the Holloway Mountain Equipment boardroom, Curtis and Denise and Wade and my mother signed the restructuring agreement. Under its terms, the holding company and through it, Iron Leaf and its principals received 72% ownership of Holloway Mountain Equipment in exchange for retiring the majority of the company's outstanding debt and providing the working capital necessary to stabilize operations. Curtis objected loudly and repeatedly throughout the signing process. My mother told him, in her flat and certain way, that there was no other option. He signed. They all signed. When the last signature was complete, Curtis looked at Grant across the table and asked when he would finally get to meet the new owner. Grant gathered the executed documents into his case, checked the time, and said that the new owner would be available tomorrow morning in this boardroom at 9 o'clock. Curtis nodded as though that timeline made sense, as though it was a courtesy being extended to him rather than the last hour of something he had not yet understood was already over. Then Grant left, and the family sat with what they had agreed to, and none of them knew yet what was walking through the door in the morning. I drove to a hotel in Cedar Hollow that night and sat in the room for a while. I thought about my father. I thought about the overlook at Frostline Pass where we had scattered his ashes, and about the compass he had carried on every trip into those mountains, a simple brass instrument, worn smooth on the edges from decades of handling, that I had kept in a small wooden box on my desk in Briarstone for 3 years. I had carried it out of the mountains in my jacket pocket on the night the geological team found me, and I had kept it the way you keep something that represents a question you haven't finished answering yet. My father had taught me to use a compass by teaching me that its only function was to show you true north, regardless of where you were standing or how disoriented you felt, that it didn't care about your circumstances, only about direction. I had needed that in the years between. I thought I would need it again tomorrow. Then I turned off the light and went to sleep. I arrived at the Holloway Mountain Equipment Building at 8:45 the following morning. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, not from hesitation, but from the simple desire to look at the building before I walked into it. I had not been back to Cedar Hollow since the hospital. The building looked exactly as I remembered, the same industrial gray facade, the same company name in raised metal lettering above the entrance, the same row of service vehicles along the east fence that my father had purchased one by one over 20 years. The facility was still functional, still occupied, still running in some attenuated version of the way it had always run. From the outside, you could not tell how close to the edge it was. Grant was waiting for me at the entrance. He had driven up the previous evening and stayed nearby, and he was carrying his case and wearing the expression he wore when he understood the weight of a moment and had decided the most useful thing he could do was be composed. We walked in together. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, recognized Grant, and started to offer the standard greeting before she saw me, and whatever she saw in my face, or perhaps just the fact of my presence after 3 years, stopped her mid-sentence. I smiled at her. We walked past the reception desk toward the boardroom at the end of the main corridor. The door was closed. Through the glass panel beside it, I could see them seated around the table, Curtis at the head, Denise to his left, Wade at the far end, my mother positioned to Curtis's right in the way she always positioned herself, close enough to the center of things to feel authoritative without technically being in charge. There were others in the room as well. 2 of the company's senior managers, the bank's representative who had overseen the restructuring agreement, and a corporate attorney I didn't recognize who must have been someone Curtis had retained recently. They were all talking in the low, constrained way that people talk when they are waiting for something they believe they can manage. Grant opened the door and walked in first. The conversation at the table went quiet. Every face turned toward the door in the expectation of seeing a stranger, a corporate representative from somewhere distant, someone who would speak in the language of return on investment and who would ultimately be negotiated with in the ways Curtis had always negotiated. I walked in behind Grant, and I watched the moment of recognition move across the room in sequence. Curtis's expression went through something, some brief internal rearrangement, before it arrived at the stillness that I recognized as the precursor to something loud. Denise's pen hit the table before she registered that she had dropped it. Wade's face did what Wade's face always did when something went wrong. It went carefully blank. My mother stood up from her chair, which was not something she typically did for anyone, and the fact that she did it involuntarily told me everything I needed to know about the state she was in. I walked to the head of the table. Curtis was still in the chair there, and he did not move immediately. I think he was waiting for some instinct to tell him what the correct response was, and the instinct wasn't arriving fast enough. I stood at the end of the table and looked at him. After a moment, he pushed back from the chair and stood. I sat down. Curtis said, in a voice that was doing its best to sound controlled, "What are you doing here?" Grant set his case on the table, opened it, and took out the primary documentation. He explained, in the clear and organized way he explained everything, that Ironleaf Procurement Group and its associated holding entities had, through a series of legally executed transactions completed over the preceding months, acquired 72% of Holloway Mountain Equipment through the purchase of the company's primary distressed debt position and the acquisition of outstanding equity from 2 minority shareholders. The beneficial owner of the controlling interest was me. Effective immediately, I held operational authority over the company as its majority owner, superseding the existing management structure for all material decisions. The room received this information differently depending on where you were sitting. The bank representative showed no reaction because none of this was new to him. The 2 senior managers exchanged a look that was mostly confusion and some amount of relief, which I found instructive. Curtis said something about conspiracy, about theft, about what his father would have thought. He strung the words together quickly, the way people do when the words are less important than the act of filling silence. Denise said nothing at all. Wade had his arms crossed and his eyes on the table, and I understood from his posture that he had spent the previous several weeks calculating the odds of exactly this scenario and had concluded it was possible, which was why he had tried to move those contracts. He had been right about the possibility and wrong about his ability to prevent it. I let Grant finish presenting the documentation before I said anything. When he was done, I looked around the table, not at Curtis specifically, but at all of them, and I told the senior managers that nothing about the company's operations would change that morning. I told them that their teams should proceed with normal work schedules, that no personnel decisions beyond those being announced today would be made without appropriate notice and process, and that my first priority was stabilizing the company's operations, not disrupting them. Then I told them, and the bank representative, that they were free to leave. The room contracted to the people who remained, my family, Grant, and me. Curtis's removal from the CEO role was effective immediately. As stipulated in the restructuring agreement he had signed the previous day, signed without fully processing what it meant because he had not yet known who was on the other side. Denise was suspended from her position as Chief Financial Officer pending a comprehensive legal audit of the company's financial records going back 5 years. Wade was barred from accessing the company's financial systems, vendor accounts, and supplier contracts until the same audit was complete and its findings assessed. My mother retained her nominal board position, but held insufficient voting shares to influence any strategic decision without my consent. Curtis told me I had stolen the company. He said this with the specific conviction of someone who has arrived at a framing they find genuinely satisfying, as though the elegance of the accusation made it true. I told him I had purchased a controlling interest in a company that its own leadership had driven to the brink of insolvency through a series of transactions that were legal, documented, and transparent to every regulatory authority with jurisdiction over them. I told him that if he wanted to contest the ownership structure in court, he was entitled to do so, and that Grant would provide his attorney with all relevant documentation. I said all of this without raising my voice, because there was no version of this conversation in which volume would have been productive, and because I had spent 3 years understanding that composure was not the absence of feeling, it was the decision to not let feeling determine outcome. The meeting ended when Curtis stood and walked out, followed by Wade. Denise left without looking at me. My mother remained at the table after the others had gone, her hands folded in front of her, looking at the surface of the table rather than at me. Grant collected his documents, told me he would be in the conference room down the hall, and left us alone. My mother spoke first. She told me she had not planned what happened on the mountain. She said that carefully, not that it hadn't happened, not that the outcome had been an accident, but that she had not planned it. What she meant, though she did not say it this way, was that she had arrived at that moment by a series of smaller decisions that each seemed manageable at the time. The decision to allow Curtis to handle my objections to the loan, the decision to accompany them on the hike when she must have understood on some level what Curtis intended, and the decision, standing on that trail, to say what she said and walk away. She had not planned it. She had permitted it, which was a different kind of responsibility, and in some ways a more deliberate one, because permission requires a moment of awareness that pure planning does not. She said that she had been trying to save what my father had built. I told her what I had come to understand as true, that my father had built a company, that she had sacrificed her daughter to protect the people who were destroying it. I said it without anger, because I had run out of anger somewhere in the second year after the mountain. What remained was something quieter, not forgiveness, exactly, but an accurate understanding of what had happened and why, which is a different thing from forgiveness and, I think, more durable. She asked me not to pursue the family further. She meant legally, criminally, she meant the audit, the documentation, the files that Grant was already preparing to share with the appropriate authorities. I told her that what the audit found would go where it was supposed to go, because I was not willing to do for her now what I had been asked to do 3 years ago, protect the people responsible from the consequences of what they had chosen. I was not in this room to punish her. I was also not in this room to protect her. I was in this room because the company was mine, and the conversation was one that needed to happen before I could move forward cleanly. She looked at me then directly, for the first time since I had walked into the building. There was something in her expression that I had not seen there before. I could not name it precisely, but it was the expression of someone who has come to the end of a version of themselves and does not yet know what comes after. I reached into my bag and took out the small wooden box I had carried from Briarstone. Inside was my father's compass, a simple instrument, brass casing, worn smooth on the edges from decades of handling, with the needle still perfectly calibrated, because he had always maintained the things he valued. I had carried it out of the mountains in my jacket pocket on the night the geological team found me, and I had kept it for 3 years the way you keep something that represents a question you haven't finished answering yet. I set the box on the table in front of my mother and opened it. I told her that my father had taught me something with that compass, on those same mountains, when I was young enough to think that being lost was a catastrophe rather than a condition with a solution. He had told me that when you don't know where you are, the compass doesn't care about your situation, it only points to true north, and from there you can figure out the rest. What I had taken from it, over years, was something larger. That direction is something you find yourself, and that the people you follow are only as reliable as the choices they actually make when it matters. I said, when you're lost, you don't keep following the people who led you the wrong way. You find your own direction. Then I left the room. The audit that followed took 11 weeks and confirmed what the records had already suggested, that the problems ran deeper than any one person's decisions, and that the documentation was sufficient for the relevant legal authorities to proceed as they saw fit. I submitted everything and stepped back from that part of the process entirely. It was no longer mine to manage. What I focused on instead was the company. I spoke to the employees 2 days after the acquisition closed. Roughly 120 people gathered in the main assembly area, most of whom had spent the preceding year working under conditions of increasing uncertainty. I did not give a speech about vision or the journey ahead. I told them the truth about what I had found, in terms that were honest, without being more detailed than necessary. I told them that the problems the company faced were not the result of the work they had done. The problems were the result of decisions made above them by people who had been removed. And I told them the thing I most wanted them to understand. You were never the problem. One of the floor supervisors, a man who had been with the company since my father's era, whose name I had known since I was a teenager, started clapping when I finished. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of acknowledgement that people offer when they recognize something genuine, and it spread across the room in a way I found, despite everything, difficult to receive without feeling it. Marcus Webb flew in from Briarstone the following week to help stabilize Ironleaf's Oregon operations remotely, while I remained in Cedar Hollow through the transition period. He managed the Briarstone side with the same steadiness he had brought to everything since the beginning, and having him hold that part of the operation together gave me the freedom to focus entirely on what needed rebuilding here. The people who had built this company deserved that kind of attention. Curtis lost the CEO role and, within the year, faced personal liability exposure that his attorney was still managing when I stopped following the proceedings. Denise reached a settlement agreement that I was not party to. Wade's vendor contracts were terminated, and the investigation into his activities proceeded through channels that were no longer my responsibility to manage. My mother retained her nominal board position, which in practical terms meant nothing, and I did not see her in a professional setting again. 1 year after the acquisition closed, the company returned to profitability, not dramatically, not in ways that generated industry coverage, but quietly, in the way that real financial health tends to arrive when the structural problems have been addressed and the work is allowed to produce results. Grant and I made the decision to rename the company. We called it Ironleaf Mountain Industries, a name that connected the work to the geography and to the business I had built in Oregon, without requiring any explanation that referenced the name Holloway or the history attached to it. My father's name was not on the new sign. His values, the ones I had actually seen him practice, the ones I had tried to carry through everything that followed those, were in the structure of the company itself, in the way we treated suppliers and kept commitments and made decisions that would hold up under examination. That seemed like a more accurate form of inheritance than a name on a building. In the autumn of the year after the company turned profitable, I drove back to Pine Glass Mountains. I went alone, on a clear day when the weather was stable and the forecast was certain, and I took the trail up to Frostline Pass, the same trail, the same overlook. I stood at the place where I had fallen and called after people who had already decided to leave. The mountains looked the same. The view from the overlook was the same spread of high-altitude terrain that held its own silence in the specific way altitude does, where the wind moves but nothing beneath it responds. I stayed for a long time. 3 years earlier, I had lain in the snow on this mountain and understood what my family was capable of. Standing here now, I understood something else, that the worst thing they had done was not leave me here. The worst thing was that they had believed, with complete confidence, that I would not survive it. And the reason that was the worst thing, the reason it still mattered, standing here in the clean autumn cold, was that their confidence had been the one thing that showed me, precisely and without ambiguity, who I actually was, not who they thought I was. Not who I had tried to be for their benefit, who I was when there was nothing left but the choice of whether to keep moving or stop. I had kept moving. I had built something they couldn't take from me, and then I had gone back and bought the thing they thought they were protecting, and none of it had required me to become someone I wasn't. I turned away from the overlook and started back down the mountain. The trail was clear. I knew exactly where I was going. There is something I want to leave you with before this story ends. The people who try to diminish you, who take your phone, your keys, your place at the table, your name in the record, they are counting on one thing, that you will stay gone. They are counting on the cold to do what they started. What Nia understood at the bottom of that mountain was that the most powerful response was not revenge. It was return on her own terms, built by her own hands, in her own time. If that kind of story means something to you, you already know why. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is remind them, you are not finished yet.